The Force binds all things across the galaxy, connecting every living being in an invisible web of cause and consequence. But what happens when something from beyond even the Force itself decides that a single thread of fate is not to its liking? No hyperspace beacon registered the arrival. No sensor grid on Coruscant's surface detected an incoming vessel. There was only a soundless tear in the fabric of the sky above the galactic city, a rupture of light and impossibility. And then the USS Enterprise NCC-1701-Q hung in high orbit as if it had always been there. Aboard her bridge, Commander Data blinked, an unnecessary gesture. But one his positronic net had learned to simulate in moments of processing overload. Fascinating, he said, his voice leveled despite the anomaly readings cascading across his console. According to every sensor I possess, this star system does not exist within any charted region of Federation space. And yet we are here. Commander Monroe gripped the edge of the tactical station, knuckles pale. She had served through Borg incursions, temporal anomalies, and first contact protocols gone sideways. But nothing in her training had prepared her for a sky full of alien starships bristling with archaic ion engines and a planet-spanning city that glittered like a circuit board, the size of a world. Data, where in creation are we? I do not believe creation is a metaphor in this instance, Data replied. Lieutenant Cedo Jaxa stood at the viewport. Her reflection ghosted over the impossible cityscape below. She had flown through nebulae that defied Starfleet cartography and stared down Cardassian warbirds without flinching. But her hands trembled now, just slightly. This isn't a nebula. This isn't subspace. This is a whole galaxy we've never mapped. And then, without fanfare, without the telltale shimmer of a transporter or the crack of displaced air, he was simply there, lounging in the captain's chair as though he owned it, one leg draped over the armrest, an expression of supreme amusement on his face. Took you all long enough to notice, Hugh said. I'd hoped for a bit more panic, honestly. Data, you're no fun anymore. I remember when a temporal paradox would at least raise an eyebrow. Hugh. Data rose from his station, recalibrating instantly. Your interference protocols with this crew have historically preceded significant disruption. Interference, Hugh repeated, savoring the word like a fine wine. Such a narrow term for what I'm about to show you. He rose, spreading his arms as if presenting a gift. Behold, a galaxy far, far away. Different rules entirely. No warp drive, no federation, no tidy little prime directive to hide behind. Here, power isn't measured in dilithium crystals. It flows through living things, Commander Monroe. Through blood, through will. You brought us to another galaxy, Monroe said slowly. For a lecture on physics? I brought you, Hugh said, and for the first time something flickered beneath his theatrical grin. Something almost like conviction, because there is a boy down there about to make the worst mistake in the history of this entire galaxy. And for reasons that are frankly none of your business, I find that I object. Far below, in the durasteel corridors of Coruscant's Republic Administrative Spire, Anakin Skywalker moved like a man already half consumed by the choice ahead of him. His mechanical hand, the one that had replaced the flesh, Count Dooku had severed years before, flexed at his side with a mechanical whir. A constant, quiet reminder of everything he had already lost trying to protect the people he loved. Dread and fury churned in him in equal measure. Obi-Wan was gone, sent on a fool's errand. Mace Windu had all but declared Anakin unfit for the truth. And somewhere above him, in an office at the top of the tower, the man who had trusted him, mentored him, was about to be executed by the very order Anakin had sworn his life to. He did not see her until she was directly in his path. Ahsoka Tano stood in the center of the corridor, arms loose at her sides, montrals catching the light from the tower's tall windows. She had felt it before she understood. It, a ripple through the force so profound it had nearly buckled her knees on the transport ride in from the outer rim. Like the galaxy itself had inhaled and forgotten how to breathe out. She had followed that ripple here, to this corridor, to this exact moment, though she could not have explained why. Anakin. Her voice was steady, though her heart's twin drumbeats of dread and hope pounded beneath her montrals. Stop. Snips. Surprise broke through his mask of grim resolve for just a moment. You shouldn't be here. Neither should you. Not like this. She stepped closer, close enough to see the storm behind his eyes. The barely restrained violence coiled in every line of his body. Whatever you're about to do, whatever Palpatine's told you, I need you to stop and think, Master. Please. Anakin's jaw tightened. Above them, entirely unseen and unheard by either Jedi, the sky itself seemed to hold its breath. Because in an orbit no Coruscanti astronomer would ever chart, an omnipotent being was watching a boy on the edge of a knife, and had already decided that fate, for once, was going to lose. Get out of my way, Ahsoka, Anakin said, low and dangerous. You don't understand what's at stake. Then make me understand, she said. Because I am not moving. Neither of them noticed the light gathering behind her, a shimmer in the air, gold and terrible and amused, coalescing into the shape of a man who should not have existed in this galaxy at all. Well, Q said, stepping out of nothingness directly between them, hands clasped behind his back, like a professor about to deliver the most important lecture of a promising but troubled student's life. Isn't this cozy? Anakin Skywalker, I presume. We should talk. Anakin's hand went to his lightsaber before conscious thought caught up with instinct. Years of war had trained reflexes faster than fear. But the blade never left his hip. Something about the being in front of him made every muscle in his body go rigid, not with the paralysis of danger, but with the deeper, older paralysis of wrongness. This was not a Jedi, not a Sith, not anything the Force had ever shown him a name for. Oh, don't bother, Q said, waving a hand as though swatting away a gnat. Your little energy sword wouldn't so much as muss my hair. And frankly, I've had quite enough of pointy weapons for 1 millennium. He turned in a slow circle, taking in the corridor, the Durasteel architecture, the twin moons of anxious energy, radiating off both Jedi. Fascinating. Little galaxy you've built for yourselves. Very dramatic. Very Force-why. Ahsoka's montrals twitched, every instinct screaming that this being existed several full steps beyond her understanding of the Force. Who? What are you? Names are such small things for such large concepts. But if it helps you sleep at night, you may call me Q. He said it, with the flourish of someone who expected the name to mean something, and when it plainly did not, he sighed with theatrical disappointment. No matter. You'll learn. Everyone always does, eventually, usually right before the part where they beg. Anakin's eyes narrowed. Grief and fury had been simmering in him for hours, and this stranger's mockery scraped against an already raw wound. I don't have time for riddles. Get out of my way. Oh, but I insist on riddles. Young Skywalker, because the alternative is watching you walk up several more flights of stairs to do something extraordinarily, catastrophically stupid. Q's voice hardened, the mocking edge falling away just enough to reveal something colder beneath. You are about to help murder a Jedi Master to save a Sith Lord who has spent the better part of your adult life grooming you like livestock. I thought, given the theatrics I've witnessed from your species, that someone ought to mention it before you commit. The words landed like a vibroblade between Anakin's ribs. You don't know anything about it. About him, about what he's promised. I know everything, Anakin. That's rather the point of me. Q stepped closer, and though he made no threatening gesture, the air around him seemed to bend, reality itself deferring to his presence. I know about the dreams. Padmé, dying in childbirth, screaming your name while you stand helpless. I know Sidious promised you the power to stop it. I know he is lying to you, the way he has been lying to you since before you were old enough to grow that admittedly unfortunate hairstyle. Ahsoka's breath caught. Anakin, dreams? You never told me. It wasn't your concern, Anakin snapped, though the venom in it was aimed more at himself than at her. Everything is my concern when it's about to end the free universe as we know it. Q said, now, Palpatine has spun you a tale that only the dark side can save. The woman you love. It is, and I say this, with the full authority of a being who has watched 10,000 civilizations rise and immolate themselves on precisely this kind of lie, utter, self-serving nonsense. The dark side did not save anyone in the story you were about to write. It choked the life out of everyone you loved, one broken promise at a time. How would you know how my story ends? Anakin's voice cracked, fury and desperation both. Because I have seen it, child. I have seen this exact fracture point play out. And let me assure you, the version where you storm into that office and choose Sidious over Windu does not end with your wife alive. It ends with her dead in a delivery room, believing you murdered children in a temple that trusted you. And it ends with you screaming inside a suit of black armor for the next 2 decades, breathing borrowed air and mourning a boy named Anakin Skywalker who ceased to exist the moment he knelt. The corridor went utterly silent. Even the distant hum of Coruscant's traffic seemed to fade beneath the weight of Q's words. Anakin's mechanical hand curled into a fist, servos grinding. You're lying. I have been called many things across many realities, Anakin Skywalker. A liar has never once been among them. Mostly because I've simply never needed to bother. Q's expression softened, just slightly, into something almost like pity. I am offering you a mercy no one in this galaxy has the power to give. Not the Jedi, with their detachment and their platitudes. Not the Sith, with their poison dressed as salvation. Only me. Ahsoka stepped forward, placing herself half between Anakin and the entity. Though some instinct told her, this being could unmake her with a thought. If he so chose. If you can see the future, if you know what happens, then help him. Don't just taunt him with it. Hugh turned to regard her with something that might have been genuine surprise. Well, aren't you refreshing? He smiled, slow and considering. Very well, Padawan. Let's give the boy a reason to believe me, shall we? A demonstration appropriate to the scale of the lesson. He raised one hand toward Anakin, fingers spread, and the air itself seemed to hum with barely contained power. Power that made every hair on Ahsoka's montrals stand on end. Power that dwarfed anything she had ever felt radiating from Sidious. From Yoda, from any Force user in the galaxy's long and bloody history. Hold still, Q said pleasantly. This is going to feel very strange. The light that erupted from Q's outstretched hand was not the crackling violence of Force lightning, nor the clean blue white of a lightsaber's ignition. It was something else entirely, a warm, golden radiance that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, pouring over Anakin's mechanical arm like water finding the shape of a vessel. Anakin gasped, staggering back against the corridor wall. The servos and durasteel plating of his prosthetic began to dissolve, not violently, not painfully, but as though they had simply forgotten they were ever meant to be there. Beneath the vanishing machinery, something new took shape: skin, tendon, bone, knitting themselves into existence in real time. 5 fingers curling and uncurling as sensation, flooded back into a hand that had been gone since a dueling platform on Geonosis. Years and lifetimes ago. That's... Anakin's voice broke entirely as he stared at his own trembling hand. Flesh and blood and whole, flexing in the tower's filtered light. That's not possible. Very little is impossible, Q said, examining his fingernails with studied nonchalance, though the faintest satisfaction curled at the corner of his mouth. Most things are simply inconvenient, and inconvenience has never stopped me from doing precisely as I please. Ahsoka stared, montrals rigid with shock. Every certainty she'd built about the nature of power quietly, collapsing and rebuilding itself. Around this new, impossible data point, she had seen the Force heal wounds, calm fevers, ease the dying into peace. She had never seen it, or anything resembling it, regenerate a limb severed for years in the span of a single breath. Why? Anakin managed, still staring at his hand as though it might vanish again if he looked away. Why would you do this? Because a mechanical hand is a fine metaphor. Anakin Skywalker, and I do so love a good metaphor, Q said, circling him slowly now, voice taking on the cadence of a lecture he had clearly delivered or threatened to deliver many times before. Dooku took your hand and gave you a machine to replace it. And you wore that machine like a badge of survival, didn't you? A reminder that you'd endured. But it was also a reminder of weakness. Of the moment the galaxy proved it could maim you and walk away unpunished. He stopped in front of Anakin, close enough now that the boy could see something ancient and unknowable, swirling behind eyes that looked, for just a moment, disconcertingly human. Sidious offered you power built on that wound. Vengeance dressed as strength. A path where you never have to feel that helplessness again. So long as you're willing to become the thing that inflicts it on everyone else. Q's voice dropped. losing its mocking edge entirely. I am showing you a different kind of power, the kind that doesn't need to take anything from anyone to give something back. Look at your hand, Anakin. It isn't payment. It isn't a bargain. It's simply a gift, freely given, with nothing owed in return. When was the last time anyone in your life offered you that? Anakin said nothing. His throat worked around words that refused to come. Ahsoka watched her former master's face crumple through a dozen expressions: disbelief, wonder, grief. Something that looked almost like the ghost of the boy she remembered from Tatooine stories he rarely told. This doesn't fix anything, Anakin finally said, though the venom had drained out of his voice, leaving only exhaustion. Padmé is still going to die. My dreams. Your dreams are a warning, not a prophecy, Q said sharply. There's a difference. And Sidious has spent years making very sure you never learn it. Dreams show you the worst version of what might happen if you do nothing, or if you do the wrong thing. They are not chains. You are not required to fulfill them simply because you're afraid not to. He tilted his head, studying Anakin with something that might, in a being so vast and strange, have been the closest thing to compassion he possessed. I am telling you, with a certainty no oracle in this galaxy could offer, that Palpatine's path does not save her. It kills her, and it kills the man standing in front of me, piece by piece, until nothing recognizable is left. Ahsoka took a step closer, her voice quiet but urgent. Anakin, look at your hand. Just look at it, and ask yourself why a being powerful enough to do that would need to lie to you about anything. For a long moment, Anakin Skywalker stood frozen between two truths, the one he had clung to for months, whispered to him in a darkened opera box by a man he'd trusted like a father, and the one now written in trembling, living flesh at the end of his own restored arm. If I don't go to him, Anakin said slowly, testing the words like a man stepping onto ice of uncertain thickness, Windu will kill him. And if I do go, if you do nothing at all, Hugh interrupted, events will unfold exactly as they were always going to, and you will spend the rest of your existence wondering what might have happened if, just once, you trusted someone other than the man who has been lying to you since before you could see over a pod race. Console. He straightened, and the golden light that had suffused the corridor moments before seemed to gather itself back into him, coiling beneath his skin like a held breath. So, here is your choice, Anakin Skywalker, the real one, not the false one Sidious constructed for you, not Jedi or Sith, not Windu or Palpatine. The question is simpler than that, and far more terrifying. Who do you want to become, now that you know the truth? High above the tower, unseen by any being on the surface below, the golden hull of the USS Enterprise Q hung silent in Coruscant's orbit, and aboard her bridge, Commander Data watched the unfolding scene through sensors that should not have been able to penetrate whatever barriers separated this galaxy from all rational physics, and quietly, uncharacteristically, hoped. 62 floors above the corridor where a boy was rediscovering the shape of his own hand, Supreme Chancellor Sheev Palpatine sat very still behind his desk, and for the first time in decades, felt something he had almost forgotten: the sensation of uncertainty. He had felt Anakin's presence moving through the tower minutes ago, a familiar, roiling storm of fear and fury exactly where he wanted it, exactly on schedule. And then, abruptly, impossibly, it had simply stopped. Not faded, not redirected. Stopped. The way a held note stops when the musician's hand is lifted from the strings. Palpatine rose from his chair, robes settling around him with the practiced elegance of a man who had spent 40 years ensuring no one ever saw him rattled. He reached out through the dark side, questing for the thread of Anakin's presence in the Force, and found nothing. Not death, not absence. A wall, smooth, seamless, and utterly without precedent in his considerable experience of manipulating the currents of fate. Someone is interfering. The thought arrived with the cold precision of a blade, and beneath his carefully constructed calm, something ancient and predatory stirred. In 50 years of patient architecture, the Clone Wars, the Sithari plan, the slow strangulation of the Jedi Order from within, nothing had ever simply vanished from his awareness like this. Dooku's death, Grievous campaigns, the movements of Master Windu himself, all of it had remained visible to him, threads in a web he had spent a lifetime weaving. This felt like something reaching into his web and simply cutting a thread loose. Without so much as the courtesy of a ripple, he moved to the window, staring down at the endless canyons of durasteel and transparasteel that made up the lower levels of Coruscant, and reached further, straining every dark side sense he possessed toward the tower's lower corridors. He caught fragments, a presence unlike anything he had ever encountered, vast and strange and radiating power that made his own considerable mastery of the dark side feel, for one vertiginous instant, like a child's toy beside a star. Impossible. Palpatine had spent decades convincing himself and the galaxy that he was the most powerful being to walk in 10,000 years, heir to a dark side legacy stretching back to Bane and beyond. He had orchestrated a war spanning the entire Republic as a single, elegant instrument to seize total power. And in the space of a few minutes, something had simply strolled into his tower and begun undoing his life's work as casually as a man swatting away smoke. He activated the comm at his desk, voice carefully modulated to its familiar, grandfatherly warmth even as ice ran through his veins. "Commander," he said, addressing the clone officer stationed at the tower's security nexus, "I want full sensor sweeps of levels 40 through 45. Report any unusual energy signatures immediately." "Yes, Chancellor." A pause, then confusion bleeding into the clone's voice. "Sir, the sensors are showing. I'm not sure how to describe it. It's not registering as anything in our database." Then widen the parameters, Palpatine snapped, patience fraying for the first time in longer than he could remember. "I want answers, not excuses." He cut the channel and stood alone in his office, hands clasped behind his back in unconscious mimicry of the very being currently dismantling his plans 4 dozen floors below. Order 66 remained ready, the contingency chips embedded in every clone trooper across the galaxy, waiting for the activation phrase that would turn the Republic's own army against the Jedi Order in a single, coordinated act of annihilation. That much, at least, remained entirely in his control. Whatever this new variable was, it could not touch a command already woven into the biology of a million soldiers. Let the boy hesitate, then. Let this stranger fill his head with doubts. Palpatine allowed himself a thin, cold smile. "The order will still burn tonight. Windu will still come for me, and I will still be waiting." Anakin's choice was always the elegant option, never the only one. He crossed to the hidden compartment behind his desk, fingers resting against the cool metal, and considered, not for the first time in his life, but for the first time in years, whether the moment had come to stop relying on elegance and start relying on force. Below, in the tower's grand lower atrium, Mace Windu moved through the crowded halls with 3 fellow council members at his back: Kit Fisto, C.C. Tyan, Aegon Kohler, grim purpose etched into every line of his powerful frame. He had felt the disturbance too, though he could make no more sense of it than Palpatine had. The force around the tower felt wrong, charged with a presence that dwarfed anything he associated with the dark side, and yet did not carry its familiar corrosive taint. "Master Windu," Kit Fisto said quietly as they crossed toward the Chancellor's private turbolift. "Do you feel that?" "I feel something," Windu said, jaw tight. "I don't know what, but it doesn't change our purpose here. Sidious has revealed himself. Tonight, the Sith end." He did not know, could not know, that 70 floors below, the man he intended to arrest was no longer moving toward Palpatine's office at all, and that the entire architecture of the night he had planned, the desperate gambit forged in decades of patient vigilance, was about to collide with a variable no Jedi Master, however wise, had ever been trained to anticipate. The turbolift doors hissed open onto the Chancellor's private level, and Mace Windu stepped out with Fisto, Tyan, and Kohler flanking him, lightsabers still holstered but hands resting close enough to draw in a heartbeat. The corridor beyond stretched empty and silent, too silent, Windu thought, for a level that should have held at least a handful of Senate guards and administrative staff at this hour. "Something's not right," Aegon Kohler murmured. "Everything about tonight is not right," Windu replied grimly. "Stay alert." They found Palpatine waiting for them in his office, seated behind his desk with the mild, faintly puzzled expression of a man interrupted during routine paperwork, though Windu who had spent decades reading beings far more skilled at deception than most, caught the flicker of genuine unease beneath the mask before it smoothed away. "Master Windu," Palpatine said, rising. "This is a surprise. Is something wrong?" "Chancellor Palpatine," Windu said, voice hard as durasteel. "By order of the Jedi Council, you are under arrest. Charges of treason against the Republic. The Senate will decide your fate." For a moment, something almost like relief crossed Palpatine's features, an emotion so brief and strange that Windu nearly dismissed it as imagination. But of course, if Anakin was not coming, if whatever presence had swallowed the boy's thread in the Force meant no rescue was forthcoming, then Palpatine had already begun recalculating, and recalculating fast. "Treason," Palpatine repeated softly. And then, with the terrible, practiced ease of a predator finally shedding its disguise, his features contorted, decades of careful benevolence peeling away to reveal something ancient and cruel beneath. "You Jedi are as blind as you are arrogant. If you believe you can simply arrest the power you're facing." Lightning erupted from his fingertips, pure, corrosive dark side energy, faster than thought. Windu's blade was already igniting, sweeping up in a defensive arc that redirected the bolt into the ceiling in a shower of sparks and shattered transparasteel. Fisto and Tyen moved simultaneously, driving forward. And for a moment the office became a storm of violet and green, blades against crackling purple energy. 4 Jedi Masters converging on a single, ancient evil finally, fully unmasked. But something was different this time, something none of the 4 Masters could name, even as they fought. Sidious's lightning, though still lethal, felt somehow diminished, as though a portion of the vast reserve of dark side power he drew upon had simply been quietly, invisibly capped, a valve turned half shut by a hand none of them could see. Aegon Kohler, who in another unfolding of this same night might have died in the opening seconds of this battle, found his guard holding a fraction of a second longer than it should have. CC Tyen's counterstrike landed a fraction faster. Small differences, invisible differences, but differences nonetheless. High above, watching through senses that answered to no law of physics or force, Hugh observed the battle with the faint, satisfied smile of a chess player who has quietly removed a piece from the board, without either side noticing the hand that moved it. "I'm not killing him for you," Hugh murmured to no one in particular, arms folded as he watched the duel unfold on a view screen conjured from nothing but his own will. Floating in the air of the Enterprise QS ready room, Data stood beside him, watching with the same intensity, cataloging variables his positronic brain insisted should not exist. "That would be far too easy, and frankly, rather beneath me. I'm simply making sure the dice aren't quite so loaded." "You are altering the outcome of this confrontation," Data observed. "Is that not itself a significant interference in the natural development of this civilization?" "Commander, I am the interference," Hugh said, without a trace of guilt. "I have been since the moment I decided." A child crying himself to sleep over dead visions of his wife deserved better than the 2 liars currently fighting over who gets to finish breaking him. "Spare me the ethics lecture. I've had it delivered by better philosophers than you," in tones considerably more condescending. Below, in Palpatine's ruined office, the battle raged on without its intended catalyst. Windu drove Sidious back step by step, blade work relentless and precise. Fisto and Tyen pressing from either flank while Kohler circled for an opening. Sidious fought with the desperate, savage brilliance of a cornered predator. Lightning arcing, his own blade, activated now. A crimson blur, weaving through impossible angles. But without Anakin's presence to exploit, without the boy's desperate love twisted into a wedge to drive between the Jedi, Sidious found himself facing something he had not accounted for in 50 years of careful planning. For Masters, united, unhesitating, and, for reasons he could not name, just fractionally stronger than they had any right to be. Windu's blade found an opening. Sidious's lightsaber spun from his grip, clattering across the shattered floor. And for one suspended heartbeat, the Sith Lord who had ruled the galaxy's shadows for decades stood disarmed, exposed, breathing hard, staring up at 4 blades leveled at his throat. "It's over, Sidious," Windu said, voice like stone. Sidious's ruined, yellow-eyed gaze flicked past the Masters, toward the office door, toward the corridor beyond, where a boy who should have arrived, should have been standing at his shoulder with a blade of his own, was conspicuously, catastrophically absent. No, Sidious rasped. Something like genuine fear entering his voice for the first time in longer than he could remember. This isn't. He was supposed to. Whatever you were counting on, Windu said, stepping closer. It isn't coming. Mace Windu stood over the disarmed Sith Lord, for lightsabers humming in the wreckage of the Chancellor's office, and felt something he rarely permitted himself in the field. The beginning of relief. 50 years of Sith patience, unraveling in a single confrontation. The war would not end tonight. The Separatists, grievous. The countless fires still burning across 1,000 systems. But its architect, its true and terrible author, knelt disarmed before him. The Council will decide what becomes of you, Windu said. Though I suspect the Senate may have other ideas. You think this is victory, Sidious rasped, and beneath the ruin of his voice, something colder than fear coiled, calculation. Even now, even disarmed and beaten, you think arresting one old man ends what has already been set in motion. Windu's blade did not waver. Order 66, he said, and watched. The flicker of confirmation crossed the Sith Lord's ruined features. Before he could suppress it, you've built something into the clones. Clever, for a Jedi, Sidious wheezed. And despite everything, despite the blades at his throat, despite 50 years of careful architecture collapsing, around him, something like a smile ghosted across his face. But knowing does not mean stopping. Master Windu, the order does not require my voice. It does not require my presence. It requires only a single transmission, and it has already. He stopped. His expression, for the first time in the entire confrontation, shifted from calculated menace to genuine, naked confusion. Because far away, in orbit above a planet that had no name in any Federation database, something vast and golden had just reached down through the electromagnetic architecture of an entire galaxy and, with the casual precision of a being, for whom galactic communications networks were roughly as complex as a child's toy, found every single embedded biochip in every single clone, trooper serving under the banner of the Grand Army of the Republic, aboard the Enterprise Q. Q's eyes had gone distant and unfocused, the theatrical mockery draining from his posture as he devoted a mere fraction, of his attention to a task that would have consumed the collective computing power of 100 civilizations. Data watched, sensors straining to interpret readings that made no coherent sense within any physics he understood. Sir, Data said carefully, your neural, or whatever the appropriate term is for your cognitive architecture, appears to be engaged in a process of extraordinary complexity. Hush, Data, Q murmured, eyes still distant. I am currently reaching into the cranial biology of roughly 1,200,000 clone soldiers simultaneously, and it is, even for me, marginally more delicate than swatting a fly, a bead of something that might, on a lesser being, have been sweat gathered at his temple. Behavioral modification chips, crude, effective, designed to override free will with a single verbal trigger, phrase and turn an entire army into unwitting assassins in the space of a heartbeat. Whoever engineered this deserves to be remembered as one of the great monsters of this galaxy's history, and I intend to make quite sure his monument never gets built. Monroe, standing near the viewport, watched the readouts scroll past faster than her eye could track. Hugh, what exactly are you doing to them? Unbuilding a bomb, Hugh said through gritted teeth, one detonator at a time, without setting off the charge. I would very much appreciate silence for the next several seconds. Across the galaxy, on Kamino, on Utapau, aboard 1,000-star destroyers and cruisers, and ground transports where clone troopers stood beside the Jedi generals they had fought and bled alongside for 3 brutal years. Something shifted in the deep architecture of 1,000,000 identical minds. The chip remained, the biology remained, but the trigger, the cruel and elegant mechanism designed to transform loyalty into betrayal at the utterance of 2 words, simply stopped answering, not removed, not destroyed, merely, quietly, permanently disconnected from the switch that would have thrown it. In Palpatine's ruined office, Sidious's expression shattered entirely, the mask of composed menace giving way to something raw and disbelieving. "No," he whispered. "That's not. No order should be able to." "Something wrong?" Windu asked, blade unwavering, though he had no idea what had just transpired, only that the disarmed man before him had gone the color of ash. "You don't understand," Sidious said, and for the first time in the entire confrontation, his voice cracked with something that was not calculation but genuine. Animal fear. 50 years. 50 years of preparation. And something has just... He looked up, yellow eyes wide, staring past Windu's shoulder at nothing. At everything. At a sky he could no longer read. "Something is here. Something that should not exist in this galaxy has just unmade my life's work in the span of a breath." Hugh's eyes refocused. He exhaled, straightening his collar with theatrical precision, though the faint tremor in his hand betrayed the true cost of what he had just accomplished. "There," he said, voice regaining its familiar lightness, though threaded now with something that sounded almost like exhaustion. "Order 66, thoroughly and permanently disarmed. 1,200,000 young men who never asked to be born into weapons just quietly, invisibly, got their futures back." Data turned to him, positronic, net working through the implications with characteristic thoroughness. "That is an act of extraordinary compassion." "Don't," Hugh said, holding up a hand. "Make it sound noble." "Data, I did it because the alternative was watching an entire generation of soldiers murder the only family many of them had ever known. And I have grown rather tired, across several millennia, of watching good beings die for the ambitions of small, frightened men." He glanced toward the viewscreen, toward the ruined office where a Sith Lord's certainty was crumbling in real time. "Besides, I wasn't finished making a point." In the corridor 62 floors below the Chancellor's ruined office, Anakin Skywalker stood staring at his restored hand as though the rest of the universe had gone quiet around him. Ahsoka watched the war play out across his face, the boy who had lost so much, given a piece of himself back by a being who owed him nothing, asked for nothing in return. Hugh's attention snapped back to them with the abruptness of a man returning from a long errand. The theatrical energy in his voice had steadied, though something in his bearing seemed subtly, almost imperceptibly diminished, the cost of a task even he had found taxing. "There," he announced. "Order 66 has been thoroughly defanged. 1,000,000 young men who never chose to be weapons have had their futures returned to them, free of charge, no strings attached. You're welcome, though I don't imagine either of you fully appreciates what that cost me to arrange on short notice." "Order 66, Ahsoka repeated slowly. "What is that?" "The end of the Jedi Order, Padawan, or it would have been, in about 4 hours, when this young man's absence from Sidious's side triggered a contingency that would have turned every clone trooper in the Grand Army against every Jedi general fighting beside them." Hugh's expression, for once, held no mockery at all. A single phrase, a single transmission, and an entire order scattered across 1,000 battlefronts, slaughtered by the very soldiers they trusted with their lives. Sidious built it into their biology years ago, patient as a spider, and none of you ever suspected because none of you were meant to survive long enough to ask. Anakin's restored hand curled into a fist, disbelief and horror warring across his face. "The clones, Rex, Cody, they would have had no choice in the matter," Hugh said. "That is, I should think, rather the point of programming a mind to override its own conscience. But it no longer matters, because it will not happen. Not tonight. Not ever, unless someone builds an equally elegant horror to replace it. And I intend to be watching rather closely to make sure that doesn't happen either." Ahsoka's montrals had gone rigid with the weight of what she was hearing. A genocide averted before it had even begun. A horror so vast and so quietly engineered that no Jedi in the galaxy had ever glimpsed its shadow. "You saved the entire order," she said slowly. "All of them. Everywhere. I saved a great many people who did not deserve to die for the sins of 2 very old, very frightened men playing a very long game," Hugh said. "Windu has your Sith Lord disarmed as we speak, several floors above us. wondering why his life's contingency plan has just evaporated. The Jedi Order, against every probability this galaxy's twisted little prophecy machine ever calculated, is going to survive the night. Anakin's knees nearly buckled. Everything he had believed about this evening, every desperate calculation that had driven him toward Palpatine's office, every terrible bargain he had been prepared to strike, collapsed at once, leaving him standing in the wreckage of a choice he had, in the end, never had to make. His voice broke entirely. I was going to help him kill Master Windu. I was going to. You were going to do a terrible thing for an understandable reason, Q said, not unkindly. That is, in my considerable experience, precisely how most terrible things get done. It rarely announces itself as evil. It usually just wears the face of someone you love, telling you it's the only way to save someone else you love. He studied Anakin for a long moment. You did not do it, Anakin Skywalker. That matters more than you currently have the perspective to appreciate. Ahsoka stepped closer to her former master, placing a steadying hand on his newly restored arm. It's not over, she said quietly. Palpatine's still up there. The war's still out there. But Anakin, you're still you. Whatever almost happened, it didn't. Anakin looked down at her hand on his arm, then at his own restored fingers, then finally at the strange, golden being who had upended the entire architecture of his worst night in the span of minutes. Why? He asked again, quieter this time, more genuine. Would you do all of this? What do you get out of saving people you've never even met? Hugh was silent for a moment, an unusual stillness for a being so constitutionally opposed to silence. I have spent a very long time, he said finally, watching mortal creatures make the same mistakes over and over across 10,000 different skies. Most of the time, I find it tediously predictable. Occasionally, rarely, I find a moment worth interrupting, a thread worth pulling loose before the whole tapestry unravels into something unforgivable. He offered a small, almost wistful smile. Call it a whim, if it's easier. Call it curiosity. Call it whatever helps you sleep tonight, Anakin Skywalker, because you have a great deal of sleeping to catch up on, and an even greater deal of choosing left to do about who you become, now that the choice that was supposed to break you has simply stopped mattering. Above them, unseen, the golden light of the Enterprise Q pulsed once against Coruscant's star-flecked sky, and far across the galaxy, on a quiet, sun-drenched terrace on Naboo, a young senator 6 months pregnant with twins felt, for reasons she could not name, the sudden and inexplicable lifting of a weight she had been carrying in silence for months. By the time Mace Windu marched a restrained, silent Sheev Palpatine into the Jedi Council chamber, word of the night's events had already begun rippling through the temple like a shockwave through still water. Masters gathered in the circular room beneath the shattered dome, Yoda's chair conspicuously absent, its diminutive occupant still en route from the Wookiee homeworld, unaware his galaxy had nearly ended and been quietly, impossibly saved in his absence. The Sith Lord is contained, Windu reported, voice still rough with the adrenaline of the confrontation. But that is not the strangest matter I bring before this council tonight. Kit Fisto exchanged a glance with C.C. Tyen. Both had felt it during the duel. That inexplicable sense of being, however marginally, aided, as though some unseen hand had tilted the odds a fraction in their favor without ever revealing itself. There is a presence, Windu continued, choosing each word with care, that intervened in tonight's events. Not the dark side. Not, as far as I can determine, the light side either. Something the Order has no framework for. Felt this presence, I have. Came a new voice from the chamber's threshold, not Yoda's familiar cadence, but Anakin Skywalker's, steadier than it had been in months. Ahsoka a half step behind him. Every head in the chamber turned. Skywalker, Windu said, something guarded entering his tone. You were not present at the Chancellor's office. No, Anakin agreed. I was somewhere else, being told the truth, for what might be the first time since this war started. He raised his right hand, and even from across the chamber, several masters felt the ripple of something wrong, or rather, something impossible, in the Force, signature radiating from flesh that should not exist. Sidious sent me to help him kill you tonight, Master Windu. I very nearly did it. I would have, if something hadn't stopped me first. The chamber fell utterly silent. Even Windu, who had spent the better part of the evening confronting a Sith Lord and dismantling 5 decades of hidden conspiracy, found himself momentarily without words. "Explain," he said finally. So Anakin did, haltingly at first, then with growing steadiness. The whole impossible account spilling out into the chamber. The golden ship in Coruscant's orbit that no sensor had registered. The being who called himself Q, the restored hand. The unmaking of Order 66 across a million clone minds in the span of a single held breath. Ahsoka filled in what he could not, her voice carrying the particular authority of a witness who had felt the Force itself bend around a power none of them had names for. When they finished, the council chamber remained quiet for a long moment. The weight of what they'd survived, and what they very nearly hadn't, settling over the room like dust after an explosion. "A being," said Depa Billaba slowly, "capable of severing a Sith conspiracy 50 years in the making, restoring a severed limb, and rewriting the neural programming of over 1 million clone troopers, simultaneously, without any apparent cost to itself." "There was a cost," Anakin said quietly, remembering the faint tremor that had crossed Q's usually flawless composure. "I don't think it was easy for him. I think he just didn't want us to see how much it wasn't." "Then the question before this council," Windu said grimly, "is not whether such a being exists. The evidence of tonight makes that undeniable. The question is whether we owe it gratitude, suspicion, or both in equal measure." "Gratitude," Ahsoka said immediately. "He saved the entire order tonight. Master Windu, every clone, every Jedi general in the field. They would have died in the next few hours if he hadn't intervened. And that," Windu said, "is precisely what troubles me. A power capable of averting a galaxy-spanning catastrophe on a whim is also a power capable of causing one, should it ever choose differently. We survived tonight because this being decided we were worth saving. That is not the same as safety, Padawan. That is the mercy of something we do not understand and cannot hope to control." High above the temple spires, aboard the Enterprise Q, Data listened to a live translation of the Council's deliberation, courtesy of Q's characteristically effortless manipulation of the ship's sensors, with the particular fascination of an android parsing an entirely new category of ethical philosophy. "They are correct to be cautious," Data observed. "Your intervention, however benevolent in outcome, represents an extraordinary concentration of unaccountable power." "Careful, Data," Q said, though there was little heat in it. "You're starting to sound like your Captain Picard, and I do so hate repeating old arguments." "Captain Picard's arguments," Data said mildly, "have historically proven correct with some regularity." Q's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, not quite a grimace. "Perhaps," he allowed. "But tell me, Commander, would your captain have stood by and watched a boy walk toward a fate that would break him beyond repair, simply because acting to stop it violated some tidy philosophical principle about non-interference? Sometimes the rule is wisdom. Sometimes the rule is simply an excuse for cowardice dressed up in nobler language." He turned from the view screen, and for just a moment, something almost weary crossed his ancient features. "I have made my choice tonight, Commander. History, theirs, and perhaps even my own, will decide whether it was wisdom or folly." The council chamber was still, absorbing the full weight of the night's revelations. When Q simply appeared within it, no fanfare, no golden light this time, merely the sudden, undeniable fact of his presence where a moment before there had been empty air. Several masters rose, hands moving toward lightsabers on pure reflex, only to freeze as the full, oceanic depth of the being's presence in the Force washed over the chamber, like a tide none of them had the strength to stand against. "Do sit down," Q said pleasantly, though the mildness of his tone did nothing to diminish the raw power radiating from him. "I find these dramatic standoffs terribly tiresome, and I have rather a lot to accomplish before the evening's finished." "You are the entity Skywalker described," Windu said, remaining standing despite the instinct screaming at him to kneel, to run, to do anything but face this thing directly. It was, perhaps, the bravest thing he had done all night. "Guilty as charged," Q said, offering a small, mocking bow. "Q, of the Q continuum," a name that will mean nothing to any of you. And honestly, I've grown rather fond of the anonymity. His gaze swept the chamber, lingering for half a second longer on Anakin than on anyone else. I trust you've all been catching up on the evening's events. Sith Lord, defanged and disarmed. Clone Army, quietly relieved of its genocidal contingency. Young Master Skywalker, no longer required to choose between his wife and his soul. He spread his hands. Really, I think I've been rather efficient, all things considered. Why? Master Balaba asked carefully. Would a being of your evident power involve itself in the affairs of this galaxy at all? Q's expression, for the first time since his arrival, lost its performative edge entirely. Because I have watched entities like myself, beings who could reshape stars with a thought, spend eternity deciding that mortal suffering was simply beneath their notice. I have, on occasion, been guilty of that same indifference myself, and I find, as I grow older, even by the standards of something that does not properly age, that indifference sits rather poorly with me these days. He looked toward Anakin again. There is, however, one piece of unfinished business tonight. A promise I intend to keep, whether this council approves of my methods or not. What promise? Anakin asked, though something in his chest had already begun to understand. Your wife, Q said simply, is going to live. The chamber went very still. The vision that has haunted your dreams for months. Padmé, dying in childbirth. You standing helpless to save her. Was never an unavoidable fate, Anakin Skywalker. It was a possibility. One Sidious cultivated and weaponized because a frightened man is an obedient man. But possibilities are not destinies. And I find myself disinclined to let this particular one come to pass simply because your galaxy's understanding of childbirth medicine happens to be catastrophically primitive. Q's voice hardened with something that, in this instance, will not be part of the lesson. You can't just, Anakin started, disbelief and hope warring violently across his face. How could you possibly know? I know everything relevant to this moment. Anakin, up to and including the precise medical failure that was scheduled to claim her life 6 months from now, a complication entirely treatable by any competent Coruscant obstetrics droid. Had anyone thought to look past the Force long enough to notice a simple physiological problem? Q's tone turned dry. Your species has this endearing habit of assuming mystical causes for mundane failures. Padmé was never going to die of a broken heart. Whatever the Jedi's poetic diagnosis might have insisted, she was going to die because nobody in the room thought to check for something as unglamorous as a treatable complication. I intend to make certain someone does. Windu stepped forward, wariness giving way to something more complicated. You intend to intervene in a birth that has not yet occurred. I intend, Hugh said, to make sure a mother survives meeting her children. I would think, of everything I've done tonight, that this would be the easiest for even the most cautious among you to forgive. He turned back to Anakin, and something almost gentle entered his ancient, unreadable eyes. You are going to be a father, Anakin Skywalker. Twice over, in fact, a detail your visions rather conveniently left out. Likely because Sidious never wanted you to know there would be 2 reasons to fight for a future instead of one. I suggest you spend the coming months learning who you want to be for them, rather than who fear nearly convinced you to become tonight. Anakin's legs finally gave out beneath him, and he sank to his knees in the center of the Jedi Council chamber, not in defeat, not in submission, but in something closer to the collapse of a man who has spent months bracing for an ending that has just, impossibly, been rewritten into a beginning. Ahsoka knelt beside him, one hand steady on his shoulder, watching her former master weep for the first time in longer than either of them could remember. Not from grief, this time, but from the terrifying, unfamiliar shape of a future he had never let himself believe he was allowed to have. 6 months passed in the way that months always do in a galaxy still fighting a war. Unevenly, urgently, full of battles that did not pause simply because a handful of people in a tower on Coruscant had glimpsed something impossible. The Clone Wars ground on. Grievous still commanded droid armies across a dozen fronts. The Separatist crisis had not vanished simply because its architects' endgame had been dismantled in a single night. Dooku remained at large, The war machine he served still hungry, still grinding worlds beneath it. But something fundamental in the galaxy's deep architecture had shifted, quietly and permanently, and its effects rippled outward in ways few beings beyond a small circle would ever fully understand. Chief Palpatine sat in a specially constructed containment cell deep beneath the Senate. Stripped of title, stripped of the decades of careful mythology he had built around himself, awaiting a trial that the Republic's legal apparatus had never been designed to hold. He raged, in the early days, against the bars and against the silence and against the golden-eyed being who had unmade 50 years of patient work in a single evening. In time, even the raging stopped. What remained was something smaller, and in its own way, more unsettling, a very old, very powerful man forced, for the first time in his adult life, to sit with the consequences of choices he had never expected to survive to witness. On Naboo, in a sun-drenched villa overlooking Lake Country's still waters, Padmé Amidala held 2 children against her chest and breathed, simply breathed, alive, present, here, while Anakin knelt beside her, his restored hand tracing the small, impossible shape of his daughter's fingers. Luke and Leia Skywalker had entered a galaxy that, in another unfolding of this same night, would have orphaned them within minutes of their birth. Instead, they arrived into a world where their mother's heartbeat continued steady beneath their father's palm, where in Order 66, that should have slaughtered a temple full of children had simply, quietly, never triggered at all. The Jedi Order, battered but whole, began the long, uncertain work of reckoning with a truth Master Yoda himself would spend years turning over, that they had been saved not by their own wisdom, not by the Force's careful design, but by the intervention of something entirely outside their understanding of the universe, a mercy freely given by a being who owed them nothing, and who vanished as suddenly as he'd arrived, leaving behind only a golden ship's fading afterimage in Coruscant's night sky and a galaxy quietly, permanently rewritten. Aboard the Enterprise Q, Data recorded the final sensor logs of a mission that would never appear in any Starfleet database, watching the strange, beautiful galaxy recede behind them as Q, silent and uncharacteristically subdued, guided the ship back toward whatever incomprehensible place a being like himself called home. Was it worth it? Monroe asked quietly. Q did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, the mockery in his voice had, for once, entirely fallen away. Ask me again in 1,000 years, he said. Ask that boy's children instead. I suspect they'll have a better answer than I do. The Force would remember this night, not as a tragedy averted by destiny, but as proof that even a fate written in shadow and prophecy could, with the right mercy at the right moment, be rewritten entirely. Somewhere among the stars, a golden ship folded itself back into whatever impossible place it called home. Its work, for now, quietly done.